Hello everybody. As it says there, my name is John Langley. I'm a Senior Technology Officer at the Information Commissioner's Office, and this will be useful. I'm just going to give you hopefully a very brief introduction to the NIS regulations for RDSPs. If that doesn't mean anything to you now, hopefully it will do within the next 25 minutes. Just a very quick note before we get on, in case we don't have time at the end. Incidentally, this is the second presentation I've done at UKNOF now. If anybody has anything specific that they want the ICO to talk about at UKNOF, please come and let me know afterwards. I'm really, really keen to hear ideas. If any of you have got suggestions for things that you'd like to hear that you think will be useful for the community, that would be really, really good. Okay. That's the wrong way. So what we're going to cover is we're going to cover what NIS is, what it's actually for, who's covered and who isn't, how it's going to be regulated, the digital services and security requirements, what the ICO does, and if we've got time, depends, we'll see how we get there, how NIS and the GDPR overlap. We'll have a quick look at what available guidance there is out there and any resources that you might have that can help you. Okay. As I promised in the title of the talk, there is an awful lot of acronyms in this talk, and to be honest, it's a fairly dry subject. This was the best I could do to come up with an interesting topic title. So if you're getting really, really bored and you want something to do this afternoon, you can play bingo and try and tick all these off if you really want, but hopefully it won't be that bad. Okay, so what is NIS? I suspect that's something that probably quite a lot of you are asking right now. NIS is the Network and Information Systems Directive. So that is a piece of EU legislation. For those of you who might not be familiar with how EU legislation works, there are two types. There are directives and regulations. Directives do not directly, despite their name, they do not directly apply to member states. They have to be transposed into member state law. Regulations apply directly. So a nice comparison there. The GDPR is a regulation. It applies directly. This had to be implemented into UK law. So as you can see from the key dates there, it was finalised in July 2016. Implementation date had to be by the 10th of May 2018. That was earlier this year. You might say, what about Brexit? We're still in the EU. We were required to transpose this law before Brexit occurred. And the UK government has already stated that it intended that NIS would continue to apply post-Brexit. So what we got was, a statutory instrument, the NIS Regulations, which were passed, or rather came into force from the 10th of May 2018. And this was part of the delivery of the UK's National Cybersecurity Strategy. That in and of itself was a requirement of the NIS Directive. You can find that requirement in the recitals if you're so interested. So that tells you what it is, but what's it actually for? What's the purpose of it? I mentioned recitals just then. In terms of EU legislation, if you ever want to know what the purpose is for any EU legislation, the best place you can look is in the recitals. The recitals quite literally lay out at the front of the legislation why that legislation has been written. It quite literally explains the thinking behind the European Parliament for why that legislation is in place and why it says what it does. So for NIS, there were three main goals: to address the threats posed to essential services, to ensure the smooth running of the EU's internal market, and to protect customers and businesses. Is it a cybersecurity law? Mostly, is the simple answer. But it's important not to get sidetracked thinking that it is just a cybersecurity law. It does actually relate to physical and environmental factors as well. That's something you have to consider with this. It relates to the entire package of security. It includes facilities management and disaster recovery, all these sorts of things. So that's the purpose of it. We'll start from the very basics. How are our network and information systems actually defined according to the NIS Directive? And the NIS Regulations, apology. That's something I'm probably going to do many, many times. If I say NIS Directive, take it for read that I actually mean the regulations. The two, yeah. I frequently make that mistake, and I will try not to do it, but please bear with me if I do. So, we have three definitions, basically. An electronic communications network. That is an electronic communications network that is defined within the meaning of Section 32 of the Communications Act 2003, which... Any of you familiar with that? No, I had to look it up too. I won't go into it because it's quite lengthy, but I would say if there are any physicists in the room, I'd be very, very interested to talk to you about whether or not the use of electrical, magnetic or electromagnetic energy of signals of any description also covers light. That'd be quite an interesting discussion to have later on. So, electronic communications networks, devices or groups of connected devices which perform automatic processing of digital data, and then digital data that is stored, processed, retrieved or transmitted by either of the above for the purposes of their operation, use, protection and maintenance. So that includes all the stuff that goes around a network for the maintenance of the network, not just the traffic that's going over it, but only for the sectors that are actually specified within the directive or within the regulations in the UK. So it's not for everything. Basically. Coming neatly onto that, who's actually covered? Operators of essential services. These are services that are essential for the functioning of the economy and the wider society. So that's power, transport, water, delivery, digital infrastructure, which I imagine covers a lot of people in this room, and healthcare sector as well. What it doesn't include is the financial services industry. They were already considered to be very heavily regulated, and therefore they are scoped out of the NIS regulations. We don't regulate these under the NIS as the ICO. We have no regulatory oversight for these bodies under NIS. We'll come on to look at the regulator model in those, but I think it's worth stating that right now. What we do cover are relevant digital service providers. And this covers three areas: online search engines, online marketplaces, and cloud computing services, which again, that third one I suspect might cover a fair few people in the room, hopefully. Fair enough. One of the other interesting points, and I'll come on to this later as well, is that you may find that you might fit into both camps. You might do digital infrastructure and you might do cloud computing services. That effectively means that you're looking at a multi-regulator model. Things can get a little bit complicated on those, but again, we'll hopefully come on to touch on that later on. Okay, you are only covered by these if your company has a UK head office or a nominated representative in the UK. If you don't operate in the UK, you're not covered. So what that means, well, we'll come on to what that means in a minute. We'll quickly just skim through the definitions of each one from the regulations. So online search engines are defined as a digital service that allow users to perform searches of, in principle, all websites or websites in a particular language on the basis of a query on any subject in the form of a keyword, a phrase or other input, and returns links in which information related to the requested content can be found. This is actually a pretty wide definition. What it doesn't do is it doesn't cover limited scope engines, so it doesn't cover search engines that operate on a single website or ones that operate on an intranet, for example. I think hopefully you can see the rationale behind that. But it does cover things like, say, for example, reverse image searches. That would be covered under this definition. Number of UK-based online search engines. If anybody can think of any, please do let me know. I'd be really interested to find out. DCMS have done some research into this. We have not had sight of this, so I can make no claims towards the validity of this of their numbers, but this is what we've been told by DCMS are the numbers. So because they're not based in the UK, Google, Bing, any of the ones listed there are not covered by the NIS regulations. It is, of course, entirely possible that as time goes on, we'll either discover ones or ones will enter into existence, and if they do, obviously they'll be covered. Online marketplaces. This one is a little bit more interesting. A digital service that allows consumers and/or traders to conclude online sales or service contracts with traders either on the online marketplace's website or on a trader's website that uses computing service provided by the online marketplace. Now, we've already had some discussions, and those of you might be used to kind of looking at legislation and trying to figure out exactly what it covers, what it means, might have spotted some issues around companies that may or may not be covered under this definition. So we've had some discussion internally at the ICO around resellers or mere conduits, I think is one of the phrases that often crops up. Also in relation to cloud services, so this covers cloud services too. I'm not going to go into detail on that right now because it's actually quite a complicated topic and I have a limited amount of time. If you are interested to know what we're thinking about that, please do come and grab me afterwards and I'll be happy to talk about it. But it does, so to give you an example, just to kind of root this in reality, for example, things like price comparison websites, they won't be covered under this sort of thing. This is not what this is aimed at. Okay? A few examples, Amazon and eBay, not UK based. And then 3 that, well, I'd certainly never heard of. I don't know if anybody else in the room has heard of these ones. Those 3 are UK based, but there is an SME exemption, and that applies to those organisations. So, again, DCMS in their search has come up with 2 online marketplaces. We don't know who they are at this stage. We're hoping we'll find out, seeing as we're regulating them. That would be handy. Fortunately, there is a little bit of leeway until we actually have to start getting companies registered, so we have still got some time on this one. Fortunately. If anybody can think of who they are, please come and let me know. I'd love to hear. And the final one, which I suspect is the one that really applies to most people here, cloud computing services. And these are defined as a digital service that enables access to a scalable and elastic pool of shareable computing resources. Now, it's going to be really interesting to see how this definition ends up working in practice. I think it's quite a short definition. We've had quite a lot of discussion around exactly what this does cover. Does it, you know, for example, cover gaming services like Steam? How far does this definition go? It's going to be quite interesting to see how it works out in practice. And it's perhaps not surprising to see this is the one where we've had most organisations covered. So DCMS, again, have estimated that there are 200 in the UK that will be covered by this. But we are checking on that. For obvious reasons, it's the sector that's likely to be involving the most amount of work for us. So we will be checking what that covers. On the topic of cloud computing, actually, this is quite a helpful way to look at whether or not you as a cloud service provider will be covered or not, and for what precisely. So I'm sure you'll all be familiar with this, this kind of diagram. It's a very rough breakdown. It's not going to cover every situation, but this we find is quite a helpful way of kind of thinking about this and looking at it. NIS covers the providers and not the customers. So depending on the service model, different aspects here are going to be covered. Okay? The other thing that's interesting to note about cloud computing services is that if you are a cloud service provider who is providing cloud services for an operator of essential services, things get a little bit complicated. But you are essentially, from what I can recall, the OES, thank you, remains responsible for the security measures that they are required to take, but you are also responsible for security measures in terms of your infrastructure. Again, I won't go into detail to that now just because it's probably not likely to be relevant to everybody in the room. I mentioned an SME carve-out. Micro small enterprises are not covered. So organisations with fewer than 50 staff and a turnover or balance sheet of less than 10 million euros aren't covered at all. And that comes from Commission Recommendation 2003, if you would like to go away and read that. So, yeah. Very, very quickly then, because we've got an awful lot to get through. This is the multi-regulator model. So, under GDPR, obviously, which we regulate, we are the single supervisor authority for data controls in the UK. We cover data controls and data processors alike. Under NIS, you have multiple competent authorities, so that will tell you exactly who is covering which sectors. And I understand there's somebody from Ofcom who's going to be telling you all about how they'll be regulating this straight after me, I believe. Very quickly, because I promised acronyms, there are two acronyms in NIS, which I'll just define very, very quickly. The Single Point of Contact, SPOC, and the CSIRT, Computer Security Incident Response Team. Now, they have the responsibilities highlighted above. In the UK, both of those roles are being handled by the NCSC. So if for whatever reason, under the NIS regulations, you are required to get in touch with the Single Point of Contact or the CSIRT, that is going to be the NCSC. And they will be providing guidance as well. So, getting into the actual meat of it then, what do the NIS regulations actually require RDSPs to do? Three things, basically. Requires you to take security measures, and we'll go into a lot more detail on that in a second. It requires you to notify incidents to the ICO. And again, there are some limits on that. And it also requires you to register with the ICO. Like I said, that's not in place yet, so I can't really talk too much about that at the moment, but it will be coming in the next few months. And we will be publishing guidance on that as well, to make sure people know what they're doing with it. So, the security requirements are listed under Regulations 12.1 and 2. And what organisations are required to do is identify and take appropriate and proportionate measures to manage the risks posed to the security of their network and information systems. Now, those measures have to be designed to prevent and minimise the risk of the impact of incidents, and they also have to have regard to the state of the art and must ensure a level of security appropriate to the risk posed. So again, it's very similar to GDPR, actually, in many respects. It's a risk-based approach. But those of you who are really up on your definitions and know your GDPR really well will have noticed a crucial difference here. In the GDPR, it specifically states that you can factor in cost. Under NIS, you can't. I'm afraid I cannot explain the rationale behind that to you because I wasn't involved in the drafting of it. But it's a really, really important point to note. You cannot consider cost factors when you are looking at your security measures under NIS. Okay? You also have to ensure that the measures cover the security of systems and facilities. And this is what I was talking about earlier. It's not just about all the stuff that's actually happening on your network. It's about your data center. It's about where all this stuff lives physically. It's about, are you controlling physical access to this? It's about, have you got your disaster recovery sorted? If you have a major power incident, can you get everything back up and running quickly? I'll wait for the questions later on exactly what happened when the ICO's website went down a couple of weeks ago. But it's that kind of thing that you need to consider. If you do actually have a power incident, how can you recover from that? Can you recover from it quickly? And it also includes incident handling, business continuity, monitoring, auditing, testing, and compliance with international standards. So if there are international standards that you are subject to, you've got to know what they are under NIS. Incident reporting. RDSPs are, thank you very much, to notify the ICO of incidents that have a substantial impact on the provision of their service. And that notification has to be without undue delay and no later than 72 hours after the awareness of the incident. So again, very similar to GDPR. It's got to include information on the time, duration, nature, and impact of the incident. And crucially, RDSPs have to assess those incidents themselves. We are not effectively going to come and do it for you. You have to make those assessments. RDSPs are only required to notify if they have access to information to allow the assessment. Now, that might look like a bit of a loophole, okay? But it's important to note that the requirements of another piece of legislation, which I'm very quickly going to mention, and the GDPR limit that somewhat, particularly in terms of GDPR in relation to systems that are processing personal data, because there is legislation that requires you to have things in place that would make sure that you can do that. If somebody came to us and relied on that as a reason for why they hadn't actually notified, they would have some very, very awkward questions to answer about what they had in place, or rather what they didn't have in place, I think would probably be a better way of phrasing that, really. Right. Very quickly, this is where things get a little bit confusing. So we have the NIS directive, which obviously doesn't directly apply to UK law, but then what we have is what's called the DSP regulation, which is a regulation, not a directive, if you go think back to what I talked about before. So this is effectively an add-on piece of legislation that has direct applicability to all countries in the Union. It does not require implementing legislation. And what this does is this specifies the security elements that organisations are required to have in place. So it adds on top of what's already in the NIS regulations. And it also gives you detailed parameters for incident assessment and thresholds for determining the impact of an incident. So that's the stuff I was talking about before in the notification. Now, obviously, once Brexit occurs, regulations will no longer directly apply. But the NIS regulations, which are now part of UK law, make specific reference to that regulation. So the requirements of that regulation will still apply once Brexit has happened. Okay, so there we go. When implementing the measures, you've got to take account of Article 2, and when assessing if the incident has a substantial impact, you must take account of the parameters Article 3 and assess whether any of the situations in Article 4 apply. These are numerical thresholds, and I will very quickly blast through those. The parameters are number of users affected, duration of the incident, geographical area affected, including the number of member states. That's going to be interesting when Brexit happens. The extent of disruption to the service and the extent of the impact on economic and social activities. And then Article 3 provides further information on each. Thank you very much. So the meaning of duration of an incident gives you some precise parameters on that. Those are the numerical thresholds for when an impact is considered substantial. Again, I won't run through those. You can see them there up on the screen, and we are running out of time. At least one of those must occur. And as I said before, obviously, that second one there, an incident affects more than 100,000 users in the Union. Again, exactly how that's going to apply to UK-based providers, I'm not sure. That's something we're going to have to look at. So what does the ICO do as a competent authority? We do incident notification and investigation, like we would do under the GDPR. We have enforcement powers, and we carry out international cooperation. And I will blitz through these very quickly. We also maintain the RDSP register. So we'll receive notifications and investigate cases. I think the key one to point out there really is that in certain circumstances we can inform the public of an incident if we think it is appropriate, or we can require the RDSP to do so. That is quite powerful, and it's worth noting. We have a range of powers available which kind of mirror the ones that we have under the GDPR or the Data Protection Act 2018, but they are separate. They are specifically for NIS. And they're all post-incident, whereas actually the powers that the competent authorities have for operators of essential services, they have some powers to go in pre-incident. So they are more heavily regulated, obviously reflecting the fact that they are a more serious sector. This is the one that I suspect most people will be interested in if they're covered by it. There are 4 tiers of fines, so we're looking at quite a different system. Yes, I can see a few people looking at that. And I think the one to highlight there really is the first one. Up to 1 million for any contravention which could not cause an incident. Now, that will basically be, okay, I will wrap up very, very quickly now. Where we consider an organisation does not have appropriate measures in place to prevent incidents from occurring. Okay, and then international cooperation, I think you can probably refer to the slides on that. Overlap between NIS and GDPR, I put this in the hope that I would get to cover it because I didn't get to cover it in my last talk. Obviously ran out of time again, so I will skim through those. You can check those slides. Again, they're on the site if you want to have a look through those. Guidance, NCSC, our website. We have a guide to NIS, which is kind of brief at the moment, but it's getting a lot more detail being put in it pretty soon. So that will be a very good place to look. Okay. Can I just say, could we just check whether or not there are any questions on this specifically first, rather than GDPR?
We do have Ofcom coming up after this on their response for that, so bear that in mind, please. Yeah, it was just about one of your slides. You said there are no major search engines in the UK, and you said Google aren't covered, blah, blah, blah. But Google have obviously got their campus around at City Road and equipment in the UK that forms part of the search engine, and Bing's complaints office is in Paddington.
Yes, these are the kinds of things that we're going to be looking at over the next few months. Google is obviously regulated under the GDPR, but what we're going to have to start looking at in a heck of a lot more detail is exactly what their infrastructure is in the UK to see how far they are going to be covered for this. But we will be looking at that, yes, definitely.
Yeah, presumably it'll be up to the Irish government to do that for Yahoo because their stuff's out there.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Obviously I didn't get to talk about the international cooperation aspects, but countries that they're based in, they will take the lead in that respect, yeah, under their relative legislation.
But there is sharing going on between...
Yes, yeah, there will be, yeah.
James from JISC, it's a quick question. You say that you're going to maintain a list of RDSPs.
Yes.
Are you going to publish it?
I don't know. Right now, I think so, but I don't actually know off the top of my head. I can very easily get back to you on that one. If you would like. Yep, brilliant, okay.
Sorry, I don't know if you could go back to your slide where you had the definition of a cloud provider. It would just help this discussion.
That's fine, I knew somebody was going to come up with this one. I was hoping to avoid that by saying, we'll have interesting discussions later.
Nah.
Didn't quite mean this soon.
You stand on the stage, you take the pen. No, you've gone past
Absolutely.
it.
Yep, there we go.
No, next one. Forget that, I don't care about that.
So that's not the one. Oh, sorry.
It's the table.
The table, right,
Here we
yes.
go, right.
Sorry, yes, okay.
So imagine, right, this is where I kind of, the customer and the provider, it's kind of an interesting delineation. Imagine you're a customer of, I don't know, one of those companies that flies you places. And all of a sudden, you get a nice little email from Barclaycard telling you, oh, Neil, you can't use that card no more. How are you? I'd just like to be really clear about how you would take this model, irrespective of the blue and the orange, and figure out who was accountable or who should be locked up and set on fire for the doomsday that it caused me.
I was going to say
because I'd like to help you define that.
I am sensing a slightly personal element to this.
I'm just fed up of stupid things happening that undermine our entire industry. And I look at that and I think, crikey, that's going to be really hard. And the reason it frustrates me is so we go and put in loads of effort into trying to comply with this.
Yeah.
Only for it to be so complex that you'll never be able to take any action on it anyway. That's kind of my fear.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks. Quick one just want to briefly, David Freeman from Clarinet, just want to briefly respond to that by saying that in context of the questions surrounding cloud providers and the regulation, NIS believe that the aim of the directive is to regulate mainly the public cloud providers. Public cloud providers. What NIS believe. I don't know what you think of this.
We could spend all day debating that, but we're going to have to move on.
I mean, we will take into account sort of, the views of bodies like NISA, but ultimately we have to regulate the legislation as it's deployed in the UK. And the UK legislation doesn't
have
specifically
any defining terms in it.
State that, no.
Yeah, the European regulation does. It's quite specific about the models of cloud. Anyway,
yeah, I mean, obviously
I'm being
We're going to have to move on. Okay, please join me in thanking Jonathan for that one.